If you are working with a small space, or if like me you just didn't get your ground worked in time to get sweet corn in, never fear. Sweet corn is relatively easy to grow in large containers, and I'll show you how. There are just a few key things to keep in mind for a successful sweet corn container crop. Now, as you may have guessed, your sweet corn is going to need a pretty large container. What I have here are 20-gallon containers, and I would not recommend going any smaller than this. The next very important aspect of growing container corn is your potting media. So with corn, it is a very heavy feeder. You've got big plants in a pretty tight spot. So you are going to want to go with the best quality potting media that you can afford, basically. What I've gotten here is actually a half and half mix of mushroom compost and just a garden potting soil. But that mushroom compost is really the key. It is full of a lot of really rich nutrients and is really going to help feed that corn through the long season. I fill my containers to within about 1 to 2 inches from the top. You want to leave just a little space in the tops there so that when you water, the water's not running out of the container, but you still want to get it quite full. I will then plant 6 seeds per container. Actually, I end up doing 12 seeds. I double up the seeding and then thin after everything is germinated, and that's just to make sure that I do get 6 plants, because once in a while you'll have a seed or 2 that won't germinate. The next key to keep in mind is pollination. So sweet corn does better planted in groups or blocks than in 1 or 2 long straight rows. And that is because when the pollen drops off of these tassels, it needs to fall on the silks in order to properly pollinate the ears. It has a higher chance of doing so when the sweet corn is grouped together. So by planting these 6 to a container, and if you have the room, placing several containers very near to each other, that's going to help to ensure that all of the ears get properly pollinated. Another key is water, water, water. So as you can imagine, these plants are taking up a lot of water during growth. And these containers tend to dry out very, very quickly. So in a typical summer, where we don't get a whole lot of rain through July and August, I'm watering these containers about every 2 to 3 days, and they will typically get a couple gallons per container. So usually I actually will just fill up a 5-gallon bucket and bring it out here and dump it on the plants. Another very important key for success is feeding your sweet corn. So as I mentioned, sweet corn is a very heavy feeder, especially of nitrogen. So it is important to fertilize your sweet corn properly. What I typically do is once the plants are about 6 inches tall, I will give them a dose of slow release, all natural, a high nitrogen formulation of fertilizer. This year I used the sweet corn food from Gurney's Seed and Nursery. I think it's an 822 formulation, about a cup of this granulated fertilizer per container. Now, depending on how your sweet corn is doing, you can come back a little later in the season, like right as they're starting to set ears, and give it another feeding. Between the initial feeding and the compost in the containers, my corn didn't need a second feeding, but your corn will tell you if it needs additional feeding, because the color of the foliage will go from a nice, deep, rich green to kind of a washed out green or like a yellowish green. And that's often your corn telling you it needs a little more food. And finally, the moment we've all been waiting for, picking your ripe sweet corn. I'd hate to have you go through all this work only to pick your ears at the wrong time. So a few cues that you can look for to know when your ears are optimally ripe are, first of all, these silks. So you're gonna wanna watch for this silk to change color. It'll go from a light, kind of blonde color to this dark brown and start to dry down. The other thing you'll want to check is that your ears feel plump and filled out within this husk. And if you're really unsure, you can actually peel just a little bit of the husk back, and you can actually peek in there at that ear. So you can see this one's not all the way filled out. So just close that back up. You can even like do a little tape on there, a little rubber band, and let that go for a couple more days. Let's look over here. I'm going to show you a properly mature ear. So here we have one. Silks are dried down. It feels full and plump. It snaps right off the stalk. And there we have it. A perfectly plump, filled out ear of corn. You'll also be able to tell when you press into these kernels, they're very plump and juicy, and they're not starting to dry up yet. So that is exactly where you want to pick that ear. So let me know in the comments below. Have you grown sweet corn in containers, or do you plan to grow it in the future? I'd love to hear from you. And if you find content like this helpful, please consider subscribing to my channel, Growfully with Jenna. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.